Welcome to The Vinyl Guide, the podcast for record collectors and music nerds. Here's your host, the biggest record nerd of them all, Nate Goyer.
Well, hello there, everyone. It's Nate. Welcome to episode 536 of The Vinyl Guide, the podcast for record collectors and music nerds. And ladies and gentlemen, today we have amongst us a giant of the music industry, Mr. Danny Goldberg. Now, Danny's name is probably on many records you have in your collection. He's a music business veteran. I mean, very few people have half the resume this guy has. He started off his career at Billboard magazine before becoming publicist for Led Zeppelin, then a vice president at Swan Song Records, and then he went on to manage artists, which include Nirvana, Sonic Youth, Bonnie Raitt, and tons more. Danny served as chairman and CEO of Mercury Records Group, CEO of Warner Brothers Records, president at Atlantic Records, and also went on to author several books, which are excellent reads, including the 2026 reissue of Bumping Into Geniuses, where Danny goes deep into working with the likes of Jimmy Page, Peter Grant, Kurt Cobain, and more. And bloody hell, we only had an hour to talk, and we barely scratched the surface of Danny's very long career, which is still going, by the way. So he's still busy, still doing things. But in today's discussion, Danny and I focus really in a few areas. We talk deep about Led Zeppelin. We go deep into Nirvana and what it was like in the orbit of those two juggernauts. We touch on a few other things. And again, this conversation is just a taster of what you'll get in the Bumping Into Geniuses books. I highly suggest you grab one and enjoy. And by the way, if you find this interview interesting, you know, we have over 500 more episodes and interviews available, including conversations with Jason Bonham on his father John Bonham and playing in the Led Zeppelin reunion. That is episode 383 of the Vinyl Guide. Mega collector and photography legend Ross Halfin came on the show to discuss his ultra-rare Led Zeppelin LP collection, episode 294. Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top came on the show to discuss his ultra-rare record and guitar collection. That's episode 500. Producer Jack Douglas came on a couple episodes discussing how he worked with John Lennon and Yoko Ono on the Double Fantasy sessions, episodes 439 and 440. And plus, there are hundreds more. Follow the Vinyl Guide in your podcast app. It's free. You can listen to these episodes and interviews anytime. And if you want to help support the show, go to patreon.com/Vinyl Guide. And we thank you in advance for your support. Alrighty, let's get into the conversation with Mr. Danny Goldberg about Led Zeppelin, Nirvana, and a lifetime of bumping into geniuses.
Well, Danny, I've been very keen to have this conversation, and I'm familiar with your background, but I'd never read your books until now. And reading the Bumping Into Geniuses, the 2026 version, it's so enjoyable. I've already ordered the Kurt Cobain one and some of the others.
Thanks.
I love how you just you set the stage. So for people who weren't there, you give them a really good background so they understand the jumping off point of where your story begins.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. It's always nice to have someone read something. Writing is a lonely endeavor at times.
Well, you've been doing it for quite a few years now. Let's be fair.
I know it's always nerve-wracking though, and but this one was easier because I was just adding some stuff to a book I'd already written.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to put a link in this episode page for people to order. Now, our show is about vinyl records and collecting largely. Yeah. And your career spanned multiple music formats, vinyl, even 8-track reel-to-reel. Now, CD streaming. Sorry to age you.
I never liked 8-track, but reel-to-reel, I do remember you'd get demos on reel-to-reel when I was starting. Yeah.
Are you a bit of a music? Does format matter to you?
No. I'm not a musician. I don't have the kind of hearing that artists or record producers have, and so full disclosure. I mean, I have turntables at home and in my office, but it's mostly just for show.
Okay. A lot of dust on them.
Well, I try to, get the dust off so it doesn't look too obvious. But yeah, especially at this time in my life, my hearing, I just can't hear the difference. So I love the visuals of it. Every artist I work with loves vinyl. A lot of my friends, my kids do. But I have to confess, I'm fine streaming. You know, give me good pair of headphones and streaming, and that's as good as it's going to get for me. But it's the music itself always mattered to me more than how it was delivered.
Okay. No nostalgia for the 8 tracks then, I get.
Well, no, I have nostalgia for the days of albums when that was the only thing because the liner notes, when I was a kid, the liner notes were just such a window into things and the artwork, and you're trying to figure out, read into it more than was there. So I have great nostalgia for that time in my life and what records we just called them then. The word vinyl wasn't a thing, and how much they meant to me. So that I have nostalgia for, but not for the sound of them.
Got it. Okay. Now, did the recent resurgence in vinyl of the last 10 or 15 years, does that surprise you at all?
Um, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's a desire to treat recorded music as art. And I think collecting vinyl kind of is a manifestation of that. And there's always been an audiophile audience for music, even before the distinction between formats. There were people that would obsess about what kind of speakers they had or, what kind of preamp or woofer or all those things. So I'm not surprised that exists. I mean, I guess but I'm not sure I would have predicted quite the scale of it. And but I get it. I mean, it's fun as a collectible. The artwork, there's just no question about it. I think the artwork is a big part of it for collectors. But I'm not the most. I'm glad it's out there. It's good for artists. It's a great way of really connecting with super fans. The people I work with, like Steve Earle and Waterboys, are always super sensitive to. I don't know. Do they have Record Store Day in Australia?
Oh yeah, yeah, it's global.
Yeah. So Record Store Day is always something we try to come up with things for. To support that retail. It's still a place where music freaks congregate and go, and so. So I don't know that I would have ever surprised me. It's not that surprising.
Okay.
Let's say that way. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to place a bet on what the exact market share would be. I'm not saying I had that, but the psychologically and just in terms of fan connectivity and super fan connectivity with artists, it makes sense to me.
Mark Maron told me record collecting is a midlife crisis I can afford. That summed it up pretty well for my situation. So, do you collect anything? Do you have any like test pressings or things from artists you've worked with? Or...
I mean, I wish I had been much more conscientious about it. I'd say 90+% of it just gone by the wayside. I have a few things. I have a cassette of some Nirvana demos that I made sure not to throw out, and but I don't. There are a lot of things, not just promo copies of records or test pressings, but just the merch and all of the other paraphernalia. If I did not anticipate there would be a marketplace for that, or I would have been much more careful about keeping things. But as someone who's moved a few times in my life, the only thing I've kept consistently physically in my life are books. But I have about 100 vinyls that I've schlepped around from one place. I used to have thousands of them, in a whole living room, the wall of them. And then as the different formats came in and as I moved from one coast to the other, I abandoned a lot of it. But I have about 100 weird vinyls of things that that either meant something to me or are obscure enough that I don't have the confidence that they'd be available in other formats. So I'd have to go downstairs and look at what those are. But I know one of them is the Fugs first album. on ESP Records. That's something I just really didn't want to throw out.
So, when you entered the music business answering an ad, you weren't aiming for the music business. It
I
kind
didn't
of
know
found
there was.
you.
No, I didn't know that there was a music business. I just knew there were records and there were record stores. I didn't understand what record companies did. I just saw the label on them or the different jobs involved. I just needed a job myself because I dropped out of college and didn't want to live with my parents. I love my parents, but I didn't want to live with them, And when I was 18, yeah, there was an ad in the New York Times for a clerical job for Billboard. I didn't even know what Billboard was, and I walked in there and I realized it was a trade magazine of this thing called the music business, and it really made me think, gee, maybe there is a place for me in the world, having been not a very good high school student and not been enthusiastic about going to college classes, but being a rock and roll freak. I mean, I like blues and folk a lot too, and classical, but rock and roll was the music that spoke most deeply to me when I was a kid. And then I found that there were also this other job, which was that you could go to concerts for free and get free records if you just wrote your opinions about it. And I thought that's something I could do. I may have not been good at high school physics or chemistry or learned French very well, but I could do that. And so that really was, I just clung on to that like it was like a life raft. And I'm still clinging on to it 50 some years later. I'm so grateful that there's this thing that doesn't require actual musical talent, but that enthusiasm and a sensitivity to artists and a willingness to just, learn and try to be useful to people allows me to, work with rock artists all these years. But when I started, it was just I stumbled into it by accident. But once I was there for a couple of weeks, I was hooked. Once I realized, wow, this is a place I could take me somewhere that I could actually stay.
Mm-hmm. I think that is your talent, is being able to recognize the moment and recognize the artist and the genius and perhaps what the gap is there and how you could play a role in that. Is that fair?
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. I mean, everybody, I mean, most of my career, I've been a manager. I did spend about a dozen years as a record executive in the middle of my career, and that was really cool and interesting too. But my primary role is as a manager. That's what I certainly do now and for the last 17 or 18 years. And yeah, most artists benefit from having a good manager. Not everybody. There are some that haven't needed one. I mean, Mick Jagger seems to be doing fine. But on the other hand, I always say, well, Bruce Springsteen thinks he should pay a manager. So maybe there's something to it. He's certainly not stupid.
Yeah. Mick Jagger's a bit of a corner case in that regard.
Yeah.
So you spent many years initially in your early life, I'll say in your early 20s with Led Zeppelin.
Yes.
And I have children that are about that age, and I couldn't imagine them going on the road with a zoo that must have been a Led Zeppelin tour.
Well, I had, the most dangerous time in my life was before I was in the music business, when I sort of went out to the West Coast ostensibly to go to college and just did nothing but drugs for the better part of a year. So that's when I was like 17. So by the time I am Led Zeppelin's publicist at the age of 22, that's sort of behind me. And it was very intense just understanding, with my first experience on a big tour. But I wasn't doing any drugs. I was at a non-drug, as I, pretty much still am now. But then I was really, not at all into that, and I just wanted to do a good job, and it was intense, but it was extremely exciting, and I had a very defined role. I was initially their publicist, so my role was to make sure that and it was just for the U.S., just to make sure that the reviewers got in, that they did the interviews, that the photo passes, and it was a sensitive issue to Zeppelin. They had not gotten good press prior to that. This was when I joined them as a publicist was 1973, and that was right after their fifth album, Houses of the Holy, came out. Or during, when it came out, we were already doing publicity for them. And they were the biggest band in the world, but they'd never gotten good press. It was just one of those quirks about the mentality of the people who were the rock critics and what their age was and how they viewed Zeppelin. And it wasn't that hard to turn it around, but at the time, it was a job that no one had done before. They'd had previous publicists, and it was a fantastic thrill to be part of that. I mean, yeah, there was stress sometimes, but I wouldn't say it was a zoo. It was intense. There was too much cocaine around, and there was a lot of urgency about getting in and out of venues and into the car and all the kind of things that come with the tour. But they were professional rock stars. They had people around them who knew how to be on the road. Some of them were tough guys you wouldn't want to insult, and but it was. I think that when I first met them, I had said, "Gee, I told Peter Grant, the infamous manager, that they had a reputation. I mean, this is in the book, but it's still one of my favorite moments. I said they had a reputation for being barbarians on the road, and he says, "Well, we're just mild barbarians, And it was true. I think that this was they were 4 years into their career as being Led Zeppelin, and I think they knew where the lines were for the most part when I worked with them,
we've seen Song Remains the Same. There's that scene with I think Peter Grant having a very we'll call it a very stern conversation with someone selling T-shirts or bootlegs.
Yeah, selling bootlegs. Yeah, I mean, I was there at those shows when Song Remains the Same was filmed. That was that tour when I first worked for them. And yeah, no, I mean, they knew there was a camera there, but he was very fierce about anyone that was going to try to take advantage of the band financially. He viewed that as one of his core jobs. And, but he didn't hit the guy. He just yelled at him.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying he never hit anyone, but he never hit anyone when I was around. And I think the guy deserved to be yelled at. He was basically stealing.
Mm-hmm. And what were the conversations like around bootleg recordings or records? Did they actually get records? Did they get copies and analyze them at all? What are your recollections?
I don't remember that. I know that in that era, other than the Grateful Dead, who had a different philosophy of it, a lot of artists were very, very anti-bootleg. They felt it violated their dignity as artists, controlling what they put out to the public. And certainly Jimmy Page, who was first among equals in Zeppelin in terms of especially the production of the records, was a control freak about the art, and I'm sure would have been very irritated by any bootlegs. But I don't remember it coming up as an issue when I worked for them, but it was definitely not the kind of thing that Zeppelin would have wanted. They were very, very adamant about controlling what everything sounded like. They wouldn't do television for the first 5 or 6 years of their career because Jimmy felt that the sound on the speakers coming out of television sets, there were no smart TVs then or external sound boards that you could get, He just felt it couldn't deliver the way Zeppelin was supposed to sound. So they were very, and then, on the road, the sound checks went on forever. The discussion about the equipment, they're very, very, very much concerned about things sounding right. So not amused by the idea of bootlegs.
Yeah, you actually mentioned in your book, Bonzo would come in even an hour before sound check to get his drums tuned for the room.
Bonzo, there were at least several shows. When it was pointed out to me that he would get there earlier to do his own sound check. He was it's such a complicated guy. When he was drunk, he could be very kind of unruly and and unpleasant. They nicknamed him sometimes the Beast, but when it came to music, he was such a perfectionist, and his drums were such a huge part of that band. There have been a lot of great rock drummers. I still would put him at number one personally. I mean, reasonable people could disagree. A lot of people like the Neil Peart or Ginger Baker, but man, in terms of how important what he did was to the live show, was a big deal. And yeah, he really wanted it to sound the way he wanted it to sound.
Hmm. I read somewhere, I think it may have been one of the Led Zeppelin, Hammer the God, something, one of those books.
Yeah.
There was a special technique for the reason Led Zeppelin records sounded so good. And the story is that Peter Grant or his cohort put pressure on the pressing plants. In the manufacturing process, they would press the classical records during the day and then the rock records at night because it was a less discerning audience. But he would have them reverse that and use fresh nickel baths for the plates, that sort of thing. Do you recall anything of that?
No, no. It wasn't necessarily the kind of conversation I would have been part of. So it's possible that it's true. It's also possible that that's sort of a fanciful invention. The guy who wrote Hammer of the Gods, Stephen Davis, I introduced him to Zeppelin. I still consider him a friend. He's had some health issues the last couple of years, so I haven't spoken to him. But I mean, he's really a friend of mine for decades, a great guy and a great writer, but definitely capable of making shit up.
Okay.
On the other hand, it might be true. I don't remember anything like that. I know once I got to by physical graffiti, on How's the Holy, I was just the publicist. By the time about physical graffiti, I was the vice president of Swan Song. I was working full time for Zeppelin. Central among my jobs was to be a liaison to Atlantic Records, who was the distributor and funder and really, other than the creative parts of it, controlled Swan Song. And I don't remember any drama about that. I'm not so sure that there was such a difference in the sound of pressings based on the time of day it was done. I know there was a big issue about keeping the sides short enough in terms of time, that there was a feeling if there was too much time on a side, it would interfere with the amount of richness and volume that would come out of the record, and they wanted their records to be able to heard loud at a time when people were listening, on record players primarily, and so I think there was a lot of thought went on to make sure that it was short enough per side, and that's probably one of the reasons I'm sure why Physical Graffiti was a double album. Was to preserve that. So that those conversations I remember. But the other thing, if it happened, no one bothered to discuss it with me.
Okay, all right. Yeah, you said this could also be a story from a PR agent as well.
I don't think. Well, it wouldn't have been Zeppelin's PR. I know everybody that ever did PR for Zeppelin, so it wouldn't have come from a Zeppelin PR person. It could have come particularly, could have come in an interview that Jimmy Page did with somebody once. He would be the one who would.
Yeah.
Jimmy would be the one who would know
Sure.
that. They definitely cared about what the record sounded like. They definitely cared about what everything they did sounded like. Sound was they viewed what they were doing as an art form. For all the stories about drugs and a lot of women and rowdiness on the road, that was always subordinate to making sure that the art lived up to what their vision of it was. That wasn't only Jimmy, that was all four of them, but he, on issues of sound, he took the lead.
Was Physical Graffiti always going to be a double album, or was there talk about having a single it was cobbled together from several different recordings from several different
I don't know. I heard it, Peter Grant played it for me when it was done. I just loved it. That's one of my favorite Zeppelin albums. I know it was cobbled together from different sessions, but I really feel it works as an album. So I don't know what the earlier deliberation was of it. By the time I heard it, it was a fait accompli. It was a double album.
Right. Okay. All right. Yeah. To
Again,
me.
I was the American publicist, and marketing and image and that kind of thing was my yeah what they cared what I thought. They didn't care what I thought about how a record was produced or anything
Okay.
like that. Nor should they have, because that wasn't my expertise.
So, what's an example of maybe a promotional idea you pitched to them that they shot down?
Um. Well, when I first met them, I was just meeting a band. I met them with Lee Salters, who was my boss, and I was just trying to think of what would they want to hear. I wanted them to like me. So I had this idea of doing a blues tribute just because it was a pretty safe bet, with a band like that they love the blues. And Jimmy shrugged that off. I later repurposed that idea for the British band Foghat, and we did a blues tribute, and that was quite successful for Foghat. But Foghat needed that kind of extra, I wouldn't say gimmick, but PR type thing. Zeppelin was Zeppelin already. There were some interviews I wanted to do. I remember I was obsessed with on the '73 tour. Um, I just wanted to prove myself so badly, and I just had this idea in my mind that we hadn't got them enough press. It was by far the most and the most positive press they'd ever gotten in the U.S. But there was a Miami Herald interview I wanted them to do because the Miami Herald was part of a syndication. I forget the name of the company. So if you had a feature in the Miami Herald, it showed up in like 80 or 90 other newspapers, including major papers, Detroit Free Press and everything. And it was coming right at the end of the tour, and I thought it could be kind of the capstone on that cycle. And they just canceled at the last minute. It really bummed me out. And but they were right. They didn't need to do it, but but mostly I wanted to please them. But when you're a publicist, a lot of the publicists I know, and the way I was, at a certain point, you're not just doing it for the client, you're doing it for your own notion of what you think would be the right publicity. It almost becomes the publicist ego. But for the most part, they wanted to be respected in that arena. They already were the biggest band in terms of record sales. In the early '70s, they were the biggest selling rock band. I mean, the Beatles had broken up, and the Stones were big, but not as big as Led Zeppelin. Uh, and they were selling out stadiums, not just all over the world. They were a big concert act, certainly in Australia, Europe, etc., as well as North America. And but they did want that kind of credibility, particularly in England, where they lived, and in the U.S. And that was we were able to figure that out by just kind of reintroducing them. Um, not through the lens of critics, but through the lens of news this is the biggest band. So this is now outside of the discussion of whether a particular critic somewhere likes them or not. Cover it as the relationship between them and their fan base, and that worked.
Yeah, they outdid
And then of
Shea
course, and
Stadium.
then in retrospect, of course, critics now look at them as one of the great artistic bands. But you have to remember when they emerged. I think their first album comes out at the end of 1969, and this is the era when Cream had just been such a gigantic band, and both Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page had been in the Yardbirds earlier in their career, and Clapton was just the darling of the press in a way. Jeff Beck, also having been in the Yardbirds, was respected by the press as a musician, even though not as the songwriter icon that Clapton was, and the press, was people in their late 20s who were looking down at people 10 years younger than them, thinking, oh, these kids don't get it. Like, I always tell people, like, dude, when you're 27, you're now old compared to the audience. You may be young compared to the rest of your life, but so that was really they were pretty cooperative, particularly Robert Plant. Robert Plant was the one who was the easiest to work with in terms of dealing with the press. Jimmy would do things that was really important to him, or if it had a certain stature, like Rolling Stone. But Robert and Bonzo and John Paul Jones really Jonesy wanted nothing to do with the press, and Bonham rarely wanted anything to do with them. But Robert really knew how to talk to a journalist. He was very eloquent, articulate, friendly, and he was the lead singer. So it
Hmm.
wasn't that wasn't like the people in the press. Everybody was curious about Jimmy Page. He had a mystique about him that very few lead guitar players have, but Robert handled it just fine.
Jimmy also had this reputation of being close to almost an occult type thing. Like he bought the home of Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, he was interested in Aleister Crowley, and I guess he had a home that he bought that had formerly been owned by Crowley. Um, if I could go back in time, I would have tried to engage Jimmy more in talks about that. I'm pretty interested in mysticism myself, but that wasn't my job at the time. But in terms of the day-to-day experience of working with the band for 3 years, it was a subject that never came up. I mean, he'd talk about music. He'd talk about Link Ray or some R&B guitarist that he was in love with. It's not like he wouldn't talk about anything, but that was just so it's hard for me to know how much of that was a deep part of his personality and how much of it was just sort of a fashion statement of some kind. But it inside the world of Zeppelin, it was not. It didn't feel. You didn't feel an occult. You weren't. Rituals or conversations or any effect on behavior. But I think he was interested in it. He liked. He definitely. He's a very smart guy and curious, and a lot of people, a lot of rock artists and others coming of age in the 60s were attracted to spiritual traditions outside of the one that they were raised in. The Beatles, it was Hinduism, meditation, things like that, and Cat Stevens, Islam, and so on, and so it's very possible Jimmy was. I mean, there's no question he had some interest in that, but it wasn't like he didn't wear it on his sleeve.
Yeah, Led Zeppelin are very good at being able to take something unknown or a curiosity and turn it to their favor. The
Yeah, no, it's
object.
like the album cover artwork, the symbols. Well, what does it mean? It means it's cool. It's like it's a rocker. It was for its own sake. It was like art for art's sake. It wasn't like about making some other kind of a comment. It was just about the theatricality of being a band at that moment and recognizing that the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, and the Kinks had already covered the sort of one generation of British rock, and that in order to be superstars, you had to come up with kind of something a little different. So Pink Floyd had their way of doing it, Zeppelin had their way of doing it, but it was really mostly an artistic sophistication rather than hidden meanings.
Right, yeah, but it got people talking, got people thinking. I thought,
Oh yeah, no, it was just so cool. It implied a level of depth that was flattering to you as a fan.
Mhm.
Because if they were deep and you loved them, that meant you must be deep.
yeah. Now, in your career, did you ever spend any time with John Lennon?
Alas, no. Certainly, depending on what day you would ask me, he would either be my favorite artist or one of my favorites. I'm just continue to have such an enthusiasm and admiration and just fandom for John Lennon. But I never met him. No, the only Beatle I ever met personally was Ringo, but I'm a Beatles fan of all of them.
Okay, never Paul. You've never spent time with Paul.
No, I've never met Paul McCartney. I just saw him play a few years ago, and I'd never actually seen a solo concert, but I'd never had the opportunity to meet him. And I'm a huge George Harrison fan. And again, on some days, he's my favorite Beatle. I mean, All Things Must Pass is just one of the great albums, ever. So I never got to meet him either. So I've met a lot of my heroes, but I did not meet Lennon or Harrison.
Got it. Okay. Well, look, your career is so rich we could have a conversation for hours and hours, but let's jump to another big one. Obviously, Nirvana.
Sure.
In Australia, Nirvana is very, very revered, particularly because they were here probably at the peak. In the beginning of '92.
Absolutely.
What are your recollections of Nirvana's '92 Australian tour?
Well, I didn't come with them. I was on the
Hmm.
phone. I was on the phone with Kurt a few times, and with the tour manager at least once or twice. My main memory of it is that it's where they shot the Rolling Stone cover of the first time they were on the cover of Rolling Stone,
The corporate
and
magazines still suck
yeah, it
shirt.
still sucked. That was shot in Australia, and because that was just the timing of it, and Kurt was angst-ridden. Again, I've written about this, but I only have so many stories. I can't make up
Hmm.
new ones. So uh, that he really had sudden, the Rolling Stone had always had a love-hate relationship. They really hated that Rolling Stone had pretty much ignored a lot of the 80s punk that really formed the artistic identity of Nirvana. They didn't cover the Dead Kennedys or the Melvins or Black Flag, and that whole thing. That's kind of why it created a lane for Spin Magazine to emerge, actually, because Rolling Stone had just didn't consider that to be worthy of the
Hmm.
level of the previous generation of rock and roller, and they weren't big pop yet. So, but he read Rolling Stone, and he wanted to be a rock star. I mean, again, for all of his angst about the commercial world, he also had grown up. If you look at that book of Kurt Cobain Diaries, written a lot of it when he was a teenager, he would imagine Nirvana live, sold out. Who did love all that punk and a lot of more obscure bands that I can't even remember the names of, but he also liked the Beatles, and so he agreed to do an interview, um, and he really liked Michael Azerrad, who did the interview for Rolling Stone, and who later wrote, the first book that we all liked about Led Zeppelin. I think it was called "Come as You Are." Anyway, but then he just suddenly had a vertigo about taking a photo for Rolling Stone, and he felt it was going to look like he was selling out, and he asked me if if I thought I could get the magazine to use one of our existing photos, and I said definitely not. They're not going to use our press photo for the cover of Rolling Stone. I said, but you don't have to be on the cover of Rolling Stone. I mean, I never, again, I like the idea of it, but they were already Nirvana. They didn't need Rolling Stone in a way needed them more than they needed Rolling Stone in a certain way at that moment. I said, you don't have to do it, but I don't think they'll still put you on the cover, but they'll still run the piece. And I have a very good feeling about what Michael's going to write. So, he said he would think about it, and then later that day or the next day, he came up with the idea of wearing the T-shirt that said "Corporate Rock Magazines Still Suck" as his way of kind of having his cake and eating it too. And I at the time when I saw that, I thought, oh man, you're saying they still suck, but then you're posing for the photo on the thing. That seems a little bit hypocritical to me. I'm thinking this in the back of my mind, but like many things with Kurt, he was exactly his instincts were just exactly right. That's one of the most famous photos of the band. It just encapsulates the genius with which he walked the tightrope. It reminds me, in the US, MTV was the most important connector between audiences and musicians in the early 1990s. I mean, they just dwarfed all radio stations, magazines, anything else. They were just ubiquitous. And he cared a lot about videos, worked personally, storyboarded all of the Nirvana videos. Kurt came up with every one of those ideas. I don't mean the general ideas. I mean almost the shot by shot ideas in all the videos. And he cared a lot about making sure to stay on the good side of MTV because he watched MTV and he knew Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, these other bands are out there. And so they wanted him. And then there came a moment during the first album cycle where the heavy metal show,
Headbangers Ball.
Headbangers Ball, wanted them on. And what had happened when Nevermind came out is it was embraced by every different kind of rock radio station. In the US, then we had metal radio, there was a mainstream rock radio, there was alternative rock radio, and then there was the college stations, some of which had big audiences, which were kind of the most experimental side of alternative. And then, of course, there was pop radio, which just had hit singles. And Nevermind was popular in all five of those lanes. It was I maybe there's been another example of that, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. It was certainly at the time unique. And the metal thing was always a matter of stress for him because on the one hand, there was a side of him that liked metal. He liked, for example, AC/DC. He liked AC/DC. He got it. He understood the musical side of it, spoke to him, but he hated the misogynistic side of heavy metal and didn't want and he viewed his lane and the lane of punk rock as being oppositional to that. So, how to deal with the fact that some of the people who like this record were also heavy metal fans, be true to his punk idea, but he didn't like saying no. So, he agrees to do Headbangers Ball, which is the metal show, but shows up wearing a dress.
Yeah.
You know, same as corporate rock magazines still suck. Just finding that place on the tightrope,
Yeah.
And nobody told Kurt to do these things. He thought of this stuff completely by himself. I wish I could take credit for it. The only thing I could take credit for was knowing he was a genius very early on and just wanting to be there for him. But every idea was his idea.
Even like the album cover for Nevermind. Now, that must have been a conversation with the record label and management about putting a naked baby on the cover. What do you remember?
You know what's so weird? In the ensuing years, there's been commentary about it because of the is it okay to have a naked baby on the cover? And I think the baby who actually was in the photo tried to sue 20 years later. It was thrown out of court. I mean, never complained about it prior to that. But at the time it was not a source of controversy or angst. Ironically, the album cover that did cause some stress was In Utero's album cover because but Kurt designed all of the album covers the same way he storyboarded all of the videos. And in some cases, such as In Utero and some of the single sleeve work, it was his personal drawings were formed the back main elements of the artwork. He had a very good relationship with the head of art at Geffen because, like everybody else at Geffen, they understood who he was right away. Before Nevermind was big, the way the band handled themselves, the vibe they had among tastemakers already in the subculture, made them the label was just did whatever the band wanted. We never had a single argument with the label. We had arguments with MTV and with some people, but yeah, the Nevermind album cover was never controversial. It was his idea. John Silva, my ex-partner and who's today very successful manager of the Foo Fighters and other people, found a photographer to do it because I think there was some photo in somewhere that Kurt saw a photo similar to it, but the owner of the photo wanted too much money, so the idea was let's take this concept and do it ourselves, and with the Geffen art director helping us. So that wasn't going to In Utero because it had some drawings of fetuses. And the issue of abortion was such a political issue in the United States that two of the big retailers, Walmart, and I forget the other one, but Kmart, I think, but Walmart was like, they're still the biggest retailer in the United States. And in those days, in terms of volume, they sold more records than any other retailer in the United States, even though there were many, many other places to get records. And they wouldn't use the original In Utero artwork. So so Kurt didn't want to be locked out of Walmart though, so he agreed to have a separate album cover just for Walmart, and it came out like a month later.
There was also the name change of Rape Me to Waif Me.
Oh yeah, that was for Walmart. Yeah, that was so ridiculous. But I told him, I was I had been trained by Peter Grant, Led Zeppelin's manager, which was fuck everybody else. Whatever the band wants is right. We don't need anybody. You're the genius. The fans love you, And I said to him, tell them to go fuck themselves. You don't have to be in Walmart. And he said, are you crazy? He says, when I was a kid, that was the only place I could get records. I want kids like me to be able to get my record. So he agreed to those changes. It was not even like I was surprised that he agreed to that, but he could imagine a kid like the young version of Kurt Cobain, and they live in a rural America where the only place that has records is Walmart, and he wanted that kid to be able to get the record. So he agreed to those cosmetic changes, didn't change the music,
Right.
you know. It was just the packaging that was changed.
And again, I haven't read your Kurt Cobain book. That's next on my list. It's clear he wanted to be a rock star, but then he hated it. I mean, in hindsight, how do you reconcile those two things?
Uh, well, I mean, I think that the rock star attainment comes with several different things. He liked some of the things it came with, the recognition, validation, the connection with an audience, and he liked not having to worry about money. What he didn't like was he became such a big star, and because of the quirk of his relationship with Courtney and the moment in the media that he became a celebrity. He wasn't just an artist. I mean, I remember him saying to me once, he says, no one even knows the name of Bono's wife. You know, no, my wife is like everybody, is in the tabloids. So he hated the invasion of privacy. He didn't like he hated that. He hated his personal life and that of Courtney being the fodder for British, Australian, or American press. He wasn't crazy about being stared at, but when he went out in public, although he was a physically small guy, and I always felt that when he didn't want people to notice him, he could walk around unnoticed, but he didn't like having to think about it. And he didn't like the kind of pressure he started putting on himself to stay big, because once you're big, that's a drug. It also that's addictive. And so there were things about it that he really hated. The thing he hated the most was having his personal life exposed publicly that way. He hated that. But he loved doing a great show, and he loved thousands of people cheering, and he loved when the videos were on MTV. He didn't have to make those videos.
Hmm.
So yeah, there were things he liked about it, and there are things he hated about it. And but his connection to being depressed and his connection to being a drug addict, those connections existed long before he was famous.
Hmm.
It wasn't like fame made him a junkie or made him a depressive. He was a depressive, and I mean he didn't have the money to get as much drugs when he was earlier in his career. But there's no when I talking to Chris Novoselic or other people who knew him, long before they were famous. He always loved heroin, and he always he would go off into depressions where he wouldn't talk for like Butch Vig told me when they were making Nevermind, sometimes Kurt would just suddenly get up and take a walk for an hour, or just and Chris said he gets like that sometimes. He'll come out of it, and he wasn't famous at all then. So the problems that killed him and that caused him a lot of unhappiness. I think there's sort of a superficial sense of, oh, if he weren't famous, he wouldn't have been depressed. He wouldn't have been a drug addict. He'd still be alive. I don't believe that. But there were aspects of fame that were very difficult to deal with. For anybody to be going from obscurity to that famous that quickly, because Nevermind exploded very, very quickly. I mean, Smells Like Teen Spirit was an immediate hit. And I think the record came out in September of '94, and by Christmas it was number one. I mean, so
Oh, yeah, 91. Yeah.
yeah.
And I'm assuming you don't subscribe to any of those fringe theories on what happened to Kurt. And those are
I,
all.
I don't. I mean, look, I wasn't there when he died, so I don't know for sure. I don't pretend to know with certainty what happened. I do know I did see him the week before he died, and he was incredibly depressed and strung out. And he long talked about suicide anyway. And I never made sense to me that anyone would benefit from his death. I don't. I never understood what that theory was, how that would be good for anybody. And I certainly don't understand why the Seattle Police Department would have covered up anything like that. I mean, they knew it was incredibly high profile. It was on the national news and cover of newspapers and highest profile crime in Seattle that year. It's an urban police department with hundreds of officers who were not, why would they have covered it up? That's kind of been my main bottom line on it. I mean, certainly the crazy people that would say that, all the conspiracy theories revolve around Courtney. And I'm very fond of Courtney. I'm not in close touch with her the last few years. I hear from her like once a year now, but and she's had her dark moments and had her own drug problems. I personally never believed I believe she loved him, and they fought and they had hard times like a lot of couples do. And when both couples are addicted to drugs, it multiplies those kind of problems exponentially. But I never believed she'd be capable of doing anything like that. But I definitely know for sure that she would not have been capable of influencing the Seattle Police Department. I mean, she was not the kind of person who would even be welcome to walk into a police station.
Yeah.
I mean, this was not some Machiavellian person. This was, drugged out, young woman with a history of abuse who's married to Kurt Cobain and very talented in her own right. I'm a great fan of Hole and Courtney, but definitely damaged, complicated person who had her bad days, which have been well documented, many of them. But under no stretch of the imagination did she have the kind of sophistication to deal with a police department. I mean, it's like just that part of it is where even the last shred of possibilities broken. But like I said, I wasn't there. I can't prove it, but that's my opinion.
Hmm.
My opinion is that he killed himself. That, and I think most of the people who knew him have that opinion. I can't swear everybody does.
Yeah, the more you talk through and look at everyone involved, the more it's
Again, I
pretty
think
clear.
if you look at it, it was unlikely by any theory. Again,
Hmm.
very dubious to me what the motivation could have been, but for sure, this was an urban police department who knew they were under the spotlight
Hmm.
and had experience with hundreds and hundreds of murders. I mean, why on earth would they have covered something like that up? It's inconceivable. There was nobody involved with Nirvana that even could have had a conversation with someone at the Seattle Police Department. This was a bunch of drugged out punk rockers, not the
Yeah.
people that knew how to this is not the mafia who knew how to.
So let's close out the Nirvana bit on a more light note, especially for collectors.
Yeah.
What are your memories of Endless Nameless was left off the original pressings, CD pressings of Nevermind? What do you recall about that changeover?
A pretty dim recollection of it. I think I don't know why it was. I can't remember why it was left off. One reason might have been for length, like when we were talking earlier about the sonics of vinyl and how less time allows a louder signal to come out. It
Hmm.
may have well been for time. It certainly wouldn't have been for any other reason. There were different tracks that Kurt did as bonus tracks, or he'd do B-sides for some punk rockers, or he liked to, a lot of different projects he did. But I don't know. I know it was his decision. He had 100% creative control, not only contractually but emotionally. The way the label treated him. Gary Gersh was the A&R guy, was always deferring. It's whatever he wanted. He did the sequence. He did, again, he did everything. So he decided to leave it off for some reason, and I don't remember why.
Mm. Okay, all right. Do you remember the approach? Were they excited about incesticide?
Oh
Gathering.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
what happened with Incesticide originally happened because Sub Pop owned a lot of the, owned Bleach and owned a lot of the singles and other B-sides and unreleased tracks that had been done during the first year or two of Nirvana's career before they signed to Geffen. And we found out that they were going to put out a compilation of the rarities and B-sides because Nirvana by this time had Nevermind, and it was the biggest record. And so Kurt asked me to make a deal where we would pay Sub Pop whatever was appropriate as a percentage. They got a significant amount of the money from it, as they should have. They recorded those songs and license it so that Kurt could control the record. I think the Sub Pop record was originally going to be called Cash Cow. It was like kind of that punk rock, gallows humor, and he obviously didn't like that name, and he changed it to Incesticide. And he knew he was very proud of his early work. He very much it was like Bob Dylan waited for 30 years into his career before he started doing bootleg albums. Kurt Cobain right away knew everything he ever did, he wanted the public to be able to hear it. So he felt good about that. And the liner notes to Incesticide that he wrote, to me are one of the most remarkable creative things he ever did. It was his statement about how he felt about being in a successful band and what mattered to him. And I still love those liner notes. But it started out as a defensive reaction to just control his identity, and then he ended up really lovingly putting it together, and he did the artwork himself for Incesticide too, like for In Utero and stuff. And I think it holds up as a very good document of the band at that stage of their career, and the same way Bob Dylan's early work holds up for Dylan freaks, But Kurt unfortunately had a much shorter career than Dylan, but he was a big fan of his own work.
Yeah. It also gave him a bit of a breather before In Utero, which I imagine the pressure to go into In Utero after the tidal wave of Nevermind must have been pretty intense.
Yeah, I think it was on his mind. What does he do? How does he follow this? Now he's relating to a completely different audience than the audience that he wrote the songs for. Could have reasonably expected to listen to the previous record, and he now was putting the pressure on himself to have a hit songs. And at the same time, he wanted to reconnect with his punk roots, and kind of working with Steve Albini was a way of having a little rawer sound to it. And he put a lot of thought into it. But he was thinking about us. I remember Silva telling me, like, Nevermind had been out like a month, and Kurt was already thinking about what he was going to do on the next album. Once Kurt realized how that it was a success, he liked writing songs and singing. He liked being an artist. So I think there was the commercial pressure and everything like that. But the main reason it took as long as it took was they were touring, I don't think it was that big a difference in time. I mean, Nevermind came out in the fall of 91, and In Utero came out,
93.
What was it? End of 93, just 2 years later. That's not an unusual gap between albums, especially for an artist that's had a hit and has had a whole touring cycle and all that. So I love In Utero. I guess sometimes people say, "What's your favorite record?" I mean, if I had to pick a favorite record, I probably would pick that. I think his songwriting on In Utero is his best songs, or the craft of songwriting.
Look, Danny, I really enjoyed this conversation. I know we only have a few minutes left. I want to touch on another artist that you've worked with. I was very surprised when I was looking at your different credits. I didn't realize you had involvement in this artist. The band Red Cross.
Red Cross I met through John Silva.
Yeah,
John. What happened is I had a management company, and I've been for years wanting to make it in the music business, and in the late '80s, I took over the management of Bonnie Raitt, and she had a huge success. She had been dropped by her previous label, Warner's, made her a new deal with Capitol, and she went from selling 50,000 records to 4 million records on an album called Nick of Time that won the Grammy for Album of the Year. So suddenly, finally, I had a reputation of being a good manager, and I had some money coming in, and I could expand a little bit. And I wanted to reach. I was, by the time Nevermind came out, I was 40 years old. So by this time, I was maybe 38, 39. I was already old compared to the next generation of rock, and I knew there was this new lane of kind of American punk alternative that was finding an audience of people who were bored with Zeppelin and what they called dinosaur rock, and so I hired. But I knew I was too old. I wasn't in touch with that part of the culture. So somebody told me about John Silva. I don't remember how I heard about him, and he wasn't making any money at the time, but he was very respected in the punk subculture. He shared an apartment with Jello Biafra. He had all the vinyl 7 inches and fanzine, and he had Red Cross. So the first thing I had to do was, so I helped get them a major label deal with Atlantic. It didn't do well, and so John really did the day-to-day on Red Cross, but I met them. I thought they were fucking great. I mean, I loved Red Cross. He also had another band. The other band he had was House of Freaks, another band that never made it big, but I thought they were great. We knew we needed somebody bigger. That's how we went after Sonic Youth. We signed them together, and then through Sonic Youth we met Nirvana. But Red Cross was with us, and they were just artistically great. Commercially never found a lane, but innovative, great band. I saw a number of their shows. Very proud to have had a connection with them, but it was an indirect connection. John really did the day-to-day on Red Cross.
Got it. Okay. There's a brand new documentary on Red Cross, Born Innocent. It's one of the best music docos I've seen.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. I'm definitely going to check that out. They're artistically, those guys, just brilliant, the McDonald's, no question about it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, Danny, thank you so much for spending time with us here. I'd love to have you back at any point. I'm looking forward to jumping into the rest of your books. And again, Bumping Into Geniuses 2026 reissue is out shortly. I'll put the link in this episode page. Again, Danny, be well, mate.
Thanks, man.
Take care. Cheers.
Bye.
Oh man, I gotta say, the book is great. I mean, we only got through maybe 20% of the notes and questions that I had for him. And there's a ton of stuff outside of Led Zeppelin and Nirvana, but those two areas absolutely fascinate me. I figured you guys would enjoy that as well. Well, we'll definitely look to have Danny back at a later date, and we'll go deeper into some of the other areas of his career. Again, it is very long, very illustrious, and check it out. Read all about it in the book, Bumping Into Geniuses. Again, fascinating read. And that's it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Thank you so much for tuning in. Appreciate everyone who's leaving positive reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Of course, those of you who are sharing these episodes on social media and Reddit forums and all that shit. That is certainly appreciated. And we'll be back shortly with a brand new episode. So until we talk next time, you all behave yourselves. And thanks again for listening to The Vinyl Guide podcast. Cheers.